Good day, everyone. On this video, today we have a Should You Talisman episode on the OS2U-1 Kingfisher. This is actually a relatively recent talisman to the collection, as some of you may know about a month or two ago, I got the talisman for this thing during a video on the M8 HMC, which I enjoyed that vehicle. I did not enjoy this, and well, that's going to stick when it comes to this thing overall. So as per usual, there's going to be in the description the timestamp, so if you want to skip ahead to anything, even if you just want to skip ahead to the conclusion, which, spoiler alert, it's not going to be a good one, you can do so using the timestamps in the description below, or you can skip to the relevant parts that you are, well, looking for, really. So, without further ado, let's get into the weaponry of the OS2U-1. The weaponry, of course, is the most important part of an aircraft, really, because at the end of the day, we kind of need something to defend ourselves. Don't really want to run around with just a Colt 45 now, do we? Which would be nice if we had like pilot sidearms as like a last minute desperation or something, but I don't think Gaijin's ever going to do that. So what is this vehicle armed with? Well, we'll start out with the rear gunner because he actually has some use, surprisingly. I know that sounds weird. But this is a 7.62 Browning machine gun with 600 rounds and has very good horizontal and vertical coverage, with it being able to shoot pretty much any angle you could need it, bar the massive dead zone, that being the tail, as in where the rudder is and everything. You can't really shoot through there, unfortunately. You used to be able to, but you can't do that anymore. And yeah, the overall coverage of vertical and horizontal is more than adequate. And even though you can't shoot 90 degrees straight up, 45 degrees is not bad at all. And then, of course, we do have a single pilot-controlled gun, that being a 7.62 Browning machine gun. You'll notice there's a running theme with these early American aircraft. A lot of the ones that I have Talismans on only have 30s, and they're not exactly great on their own. This has 500 rounds, which is 100 less than the rear gunner, but of course the gunner gets a reload. We don't. We have to manually land on an airfield to do that. And yeah, it doesn't exactly have a great, shall we say, armament overall. This is pretty weak. And of course, the armor of the aircraft is just a single 9.5mm steel plate, which only protects the gunner. Now, if we take a look at the other one available in the tree, which is the Dash 3 model, you'll notice this one actually has a bit more armor for both the gunner and actually has some armor for the pilot. So yeah, not off to a great start. And it doesn't get much better when you look at the aircraft's potential performance, which is a Pratt & Whitney R985-48 9-cylinder radial. It produces 450 horsepower on takeoff power, which is the exact same horsepower output as an Aston Martin DB9 car, which I'd love to own one of those things one day, but they cost an arm and a leg. And funnily enough, the DB9 actually goes at a higher top speed than this thing, because this aircraft tops out at 184, but that's a whole different story. This aircraft does come with optional secondary weapons, which I'd advise just taking them for the bants, really, because like they're not very big bombs. You get access to a pair of 100-pound bombs. I've covered these bombs previously in the series. I'm not really going to talk about them here because they're the exact same bombs. But overall, these are pretty okay. They'll deal with anything you'll come across. You'll just need a direct hit on some targets to kill them. You can land them relatively close to something and it will kill them as long as it's open top and or a AI ground target. But if it comes to an enemy tank, you're going to want to land these pretty much on their engine deck if you can. And the explosive amount will be more than enough to deal with them. But of course, one other thing that this aircraft has is separate bomb dropping, which isn't common at lower tiers, at least for aircraft like this. So these little bombs do drop individually. So that is pretty helpful. And of course, with it having the guns that it does, it can mark some stuff in ground RB and of course drop a single bomb to kill a tank and drop another one to kill a tank. That's if your bomb accuracy is that good, of course, and if the person doesn't just drive away from the bomb, but, you know. So that's the weaponry, and as you can tell, I don't really advise running stealth on the 7.62 for the offensive gun. I'd actually recommend running armoured because this has a bit more AP and just a bit more of a versatility belt. And it does, of course, have the same incendiary bullet, which isn't really going to do jack all. but there is the opportunity to set someone on fire should that arise. And it may happen, it may not, but, it's something to think about. But yeah, now that we've took a look at the aircraft's overall armament and everything, and took a brief bit of the engine as well, let's go take a look at how it handles in the test flight. I'll see you all in just a moment. And welcome to the test flight. Now, one thing that is important to note is you might want to take a look at the fuel gauge up at the top left. This vehicle has a minimum fuel of 1 hour. And the only fuel tank is right in the center of the aircraft. So yeah, this thing doesn't exactly have a light airframe, to put it simply. Now, of course, we are taking off from water, so don't consider this as part of the aircraft's takeoff run, because you always get an air spawn on the maps that you'll play. So this bit isn't really relevant to the aircraft's performance. But, as you can tell, if you are going to be mucking around in custom battles with this thing, its takeoff performance from water isn't great. Of course, if you're a naval player, you will probably be taking off from water after capping a point. And as you can tell, this thing's not exactly a speed demon. And obviously we've just taken off, but the engine horsepower is of course very lackluster. The overall acceleration of the aircraft is also rather lackluster. And yeah. Its roll rate isn't great either, as you can tell there. It takes quite a while for it to roll itself over. The overall handling at low speed is very clunky on most control settings. I've even tried this thing on a stick once and it felt horrible. I don't know how pilots actually flew this thing IRL. But it just doesn't feel relatively maneuverable. Like, it can turn to some extent if you've watched my Talisman video on this thing. But, like, for attacking even basic ground targets, it's just not very good. But dedicated fire on something like a P-40's engine block can, of course, do something, but you're not going to run into P-40s in this thing. Unless you're up tiering this thing in ground RB, in which case, God help you. But as you'll notice, the low speed handling is extremely poor. Now, of course, you having an air spawn in Air RB does make it a little bit more beneficial for you. And of course, with the bombs being relatively light, you can very easily deal with stuff that only require a single bomb, like those trucks there. But realistically, you don't want to waste a bomb on a truck. So you think the gun would do some work. But it takes quite a while to put a truck down, and it's just not very beneficial for the aircraft's performance. And obviously, because it's got such lack of power, you're going to want to wet this thing constantly. But as you see with the temperatures, it doesn't like overheating, and it doesn't like the engine being wet at all, really. Like, it can handle it, and if you use mech, you can open the radiators, but it just lacks in its overall capability because of that. You can't really get this thing to do anything because it just lacks the power. And as you'll notice in the Talisman video, if you go and watch that, it just doesn't handle particularly great enough to deal with anything that it might run into, like biplanes or whatever. And it's just not that good, I'm afraid. And as I said, the engine overheating does come into play on most maps that this thing will encounter. And sure, its landing capability on water is pretty simple. You do get flaps, it can fly really slow, and if you need to cap a point in naval, it's really good for that, because, well, it's as simple as that. Nice and easy touchdown, flaps back in, and there we go. It's as simple as that. Of course, the seas are a little bit choppy here, but, you know, it's like, this thing is good for naval, but it's terrible everywhere else. And even then, in naval, people have PT boats that can just shoot you down in a single hit. So, take with that what you will. Anyway, let's head back to the hangar and take a look at this aircraft competition because, trust me, there's a lot. I'll see you all in a moment. And welcome back to the hangar. As you'll probably notice, this thing has a lot of competition. Now, at least with the pea shooters, the 50 cal pea shooter has a 50 cal, has better performance because obviously it's a dedicated fighter aircraft, and just overall, it really just is better. But even when we take a look at the aircraft that we previously covered in this series, the OS2U-2, this thing gets beaten by that in pretty much every metric that you need, such as bomb load. Obviously, the guns are pretty much the same, just the SB2U gets an extra front gun. But the SB2U, whilst it isn't much better in terms of its handling, it can arguably turn better. It handles a bit better, obviously. It handles worse at lower speeds, but that's a fair trade-off. And just overall, it just doesn't really do anything that would redeem itself. And as I said, if you really want to Talisman one, I'd actually Talisman the 3, because the Dash 3 has a bit of pilot protection, which could help out in naval, and overall, whilst it does have a bit worse flight performance because of the extra weight, it's worth the trade-off because you have a bit more protection, you have a bit more durability, so to speak. And whilst it doesn't really gain anything from that in terms of engine performance, overall acceleration, things like that, I have had situations where the Dash 3's armor has actually kept my crew alive to some extent. Obviously, they've been wounded and things like that, but because I have a high-level crew, they've still been able to survive because the armor plate has mostly mitigated the kinetic energy of the projectile. So if you really want a Talisman, one of the float, or one of these two, go for the 3. But in terms of overall dedicated bombers and things like that, as I mentioned previously, the TBD-1 is an amazing vehicle. It's very versatile, it has a 50 caliber gun, and even if you go to your secondary weapons, you have 2 500-pound bombs and 6 100s. The 100s, as I've said, they're good bombs, but the 500, which we haven't actually covered in this series yet, because I like to go into detail about those sorts of things, this is a good bomb for low-tier ground RP. It has really good high explosive, shall we say, destruction ability. It has pretty good radius of destruction of armored vehicles. And its fragment dispersion is also pretty solid. So it's a good bomb. And this thing's handling is so much better than the Kingfisher. Sure, at low speeds it does get a bit boaty, which is what the Devastator was known for. But even then, you get a 50 cal front gun, which can deal with a lot of targets. And as previously mentioned, because we will be covering Dauntless at some point, this thing's a beast in terms of its capability compared to the SB2U and the OS2U. This thing's a beast, and I still sometimes, if I'm mucking around with friends or whatever, and I need a low-tier ground arcade or ground RB aircraft, I take this thing along. You get gun pods. You can choose to take bombs if you wish. Yeah, you have to deal with a bomb trapeze for the 1,000 pounder, but that's worth the trade-off considering how accurate you can be with a Dauntless. And heck, once Gaijin introduces more variants of the Dauntless, you can bet I will be covering those in reviews ASAP. And even when it comes to dedicated fighters, you've got stuff like F2A3, P36G, which to be fair shouldn't be that BR, but whatever. The M2P shooter, the P36A, the F3F2. There's no real reason to Talisman the OS2U-1, and as I said, if you're a naval player, just go with the 3 or one of the Catalinas. And when we get to the Catalinas, you'll see just how much better these are for more tasks than the Kingfisher ever will. And unfortunately, that leads us to the conclusion of the OS2U-1 Kingfisher. The only thing this thing will be fishing is the, shall we say, the coral and the possible sea lion that might sleep in the cockpit, because that's all this thing's ever going to get. Its one video was more than enough for me taking this thing out in terms of an actual match. And yeah, I'm not particularly happy with this thing, so it's getting trashed on. And most importantly, there are just better vehicles than it, which, to be fair, you don't need me to tell you that. In terms of the next vehicle for the series, however, we will be moving on to something a lot more interesting. Probably one of the most aircraft that I've highly rated so far throughout this series, the F3F2. I'm looking forward to this one because, trust me, there's a reason why I recommend it. Anyway, I'm going to leave you all to it for today. I hope you enjoyed seeing the OS2U-1 get trashed on because it deserves it. And I will see you all on the next one.